Okay, welcome back. We're gonna do week 2 tasks today. And basically, we are gonna focus a little bit more on threat intelligence gathering. This class might sound like CIS-47B for some part, but I think that it's gonna give you a little bit more information about analysis tools, um, and then how that plays into our role as analysts in cybersecurity. So for the beginning of the notes, it's going to give you the 3 categories or the 3 levels of threat intelligence. And this is going to give you the overall breakdown on how we go through and look at, different types of threats. And then to be able to look at threats that are maybe entering your network or existing in your system or potentially could be arriving to your system in the future. So some of it you are going to have to do some research, and then some of it you are going to have to assess, right, based on your historical data. So threat intelligence, it tells you here that you are going to look at the real world information. So it's going to break down into 3 levels, right? So in the first question, which is for chapter 2, it asks you to describe the 3 categories of threat intelligence. When should each category be used? So we want to say that the first category is going to be your strategic threat intelligence. And like the notes indicate, this is broader information. It contains wider information on the threat actors for the organization and understanding the trends and response. So your threat actor could be a malware, right? And we want to take a look at that. The trend for the malware. So in the case that if an organization already be facing ransomware, or they've had incident with ransomware, that would be in existence already, right? So it contains broader information about that particular threat and specific actors and how you can expand on that threat that would relate to your response, right? So in ransomware, a lot of the times it comes back to a few things, right? Maybe we don't have effective controls in blocking the ransomware, and also it comes in from the human vulnerability. So likely that someone clicks something and it activates the download for the ransomware, and a lot of the times it's spread quickly. So we need to also monitor the network better. So we have to take a look at the trends and the response. Sometimes the trends will come from industry, real world information, case scenario. So you're going to have to do some research. And so this is used in developing security plans. So you want to use strategic threat intelligence to build out your security solutions because it gives you a broader understanding of the patterns that you're facing with that threat and how to prevent that threat, right? The second area is your tactical threat intelligence. And this is more technical and detailed. When you're looking at the malware, we want to look at the behavior. Or if you're looking at attack, we want to see the attack pattern, the protocols, the ports, the services that's being used to perform that attack, and how it is directly impacting your security in that organization. So tactical threat intelligence really means, right, that is directly technically involving, right, with the organization or the professional. So what do we use this information for? We would use it to configure, right, your security appliance and systems. And it doesn't have to be like for firewall, your network intrusion prevention system. It can be used to configure your security settings on your endpoints, right? Like when we're looking at malware, a lot of times it's actually impacting users, the people who are using your endpoint system. And so we want to use this information, for example, right? Like if you're dealing with rootkit, you might have to run a few scripts, right? Or if you're dealing with like other issues like malware that's coming in, like ransomware, you have to take a look at the behavior of the ransomware, like how it gets there, how it evolves, right? How it spreads through the network. And so we want to do a better job in the configuration of our system. The third area is your operational threat intelligence. And this gives you the information on how to respond to threat, that where it comes from, how it changes, the capability, the behavior, and the prevention. So it is also on the higher level, but it also piggyback on what you've done in the tactical threat intelligence. I really feel that these three categories, they are intertwined, okay? And so you can't really build a security plan by just looking at one area. That's what we're telling you. That you have to really flourish your plan through looking at these three categories of your threat, right? Who's your threat actor? How can you prevent it technically, right? What kind of technical information do you have on it? And how you're going to be able to defend and combat or do preventative measures down the line. Do you have any question for me? Okay, this information you can find on page 1 of our notes. So I wanted to use the next couple of exercises to kind of give you some resources that you see in the industry. I know some of you might have seen these resources before. These things can be important for your practice, but also important when you're interviewing for specific jobs. So, now, if you visit virusshare.com, you're gonna see some information on the malware that is shared in the community, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna open that up real quick. I know some of you are writing down some information. So typically you're gonna get some sample information on, malware, right? These are also being reported by your malware tools, anti-malware tool. And a lot of times you're gonna see across like variation of these things. Sometimes they're named differently. And then also sometimes they're also unknown, right? So in the exercise, it tells you to look at the recent malware sample, and then you're going to take the hash value and you're going to copy it, and you're going to record the information here. So what are we achieving in this step? So if, for example, if you're facing a Trojan, a recent Trojan like what is shown on the website, you want to identify it using the hash, okay? Because it might be in your network or your system as an unknown threat, right? Your security software, it might be able to block it, right? Or contain it, but it might not have the definition for it. So the whole point in using virus share is to get the latest information and getting the technical threat intelligence applied here, okay? So what you want is you want its hash value. You want to look at its size because that's going to help you analyze, is the malware that I'm working with, is it this type, right? Because the payload size, it's going to be shown in your network activity, and it's also shown on the download. It was downloaded, right, by a user or by a system. And then the file type. So, I'm sorry. So if you're looking at the website, let me see, I think it's coming up with Bing because I did control click, right? When you look at the website, you're going to see, right, your MD5 hashes here. They also provide like link information. And then if you need to record like different hash type, it's also shown there. The file type, this is what you see, that it's coming through as an HTML document. And so if you go down, so there's variation of how it's detected by different security software. And typically it is a Trojan. And in the prior class, you should know what a Trojan does, right? So it masquerades, it actually look like it might be benign or friendly, but it could not be. So they might have a script that is incorporated into the code. And so it's using web type of script, and also there might be also native or lower language that is incorporated. So we kind of have to see a little bit more, right? So the file type is coming down as a .html, and so on, right? And if you visit this website down the line, you're gonna see that there's gonna be different ones, even the next week, right? So that's what you see. So what I want you to do is, in your role as an analyst, when you're investigating, when you're gathering intelligence, especially on a threat like a malware, this is what you do, right? Your security software is going to say maybe Trojan A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You want to look at the community on what the other softwares are detecting it as, record that information, you have to document it, and then you want to look further into its behavior, which is going to be in this area. Okay. Any question? Okay, so I also want to bring this up. I give you many links in your notes. Do not disregard them because you will find them as useful. Um, from my experience, and if you talk to a lot of the professionals, they're going to tell you about the type of work that we do. So the more resourceful you are as a professional, the tools that you have and your knowledge and skills in those tools are going to help you in the long run. You don't want to get to the point where, you know, the common tools are out there. You're going to have to figure out how to use it, like, you know, on the fly. It's very stressful. Okay. So it's always good to kind of have a, you know, a general understanding of what these tools are doing, what they're being used for. So I'm giving you some threat feeds information here. This is useful when you need IP addresses, when we're talking about public IP, host name, domains, email, gathering intelligence about individual organization or, you know, specific objects or subject, right? These things can be useful. Okay. There are many resources in the industry. I gave you the virus share information, but you know, Microsoft has its own threat intelligence platform, etc. And then you got MISP and so on, right? It really depends on what you're using these things for. So if you have specific focus, they do have emphasis. Okay. All right. Um, so you might also, if your organization, let's say if you work for a company that uses closed source or proprietary, they might have a tool that they buy, right? That's going to give you the threat feeds, and your threat feeds contains important information. So when you're assessing your threat, make sure that it is in a timely period. Okay. So if we go back and we assess something from 2 years ago, that might not be relevant anymore because, as you know, a lot of the things that we deal with evolve, right? Attacks, exploitation, and even malware changes over time very quickly. Also, you need to make sure that your information is accurate. So we got to do validation. So if you took like forensic or 27B with me, right? We talked about this. Information doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, right? We want to make sure that we validate that across. And is it relevant? Okay, so those are the things that you need to ask. Okay, so let's look at some of the vulnerabilities that exist. So last week we talked about what is a threat, what is a vulnerability. This week we're going to look at a real feed of these things, right? So you can go to CISA. you know that they just revamped the whole organization, right? Um, recently. And I think some of the directors have been replaced, etc. So what you can see is when you go through, there are emergency directive. You also see CVE information that's here, right? If you go down to the bottom, let me see if I can find it again. I think there's a section where it tells you that you can find, um, yeah, so alerts and advisories, that's on the right side. Yeah, you see a blue button on the, kind of like near the bottom. So you want to go there. So there are different types of advisory that's listed here. You can choose any of them, that's fine. If you want more, you can click this blue button, right? So they just list some of the known vulnerabilities that are recent. And so they also date the information. So sometime you might be dealing with IoT devices. That's very common, right? Even some things like the home kit, some of these devices are prone to have vulnerabilities. So now if you are not happy with what you see here and you want more information, you can click on the alerts. And so you have to go through and you can filter out, right? If you want specific advisory, so you can scroll down and you can see some of the known exploited vulnerability. So these are the vulnerabilities that's being already been used for exploitation. And so CISA document that. Okay. So what I want you to do is you're gonna go find one. So let's do a Cisco one, right? And then you are going to look at the CVE information. So they document it by identifying that common vulnerability, and they give it an ID number, okay? And then if you go down, you might be able to also find related information to it, um, you know. So what I want you to do is, let me see if there's a VU number for that one. Sometimes if you get a general article like this, you might not get the specific. So you're gonna have to click like a specific device, right? So I can do like an SD-WAN one. So you wanted something like this. Okay. So what I did was, right, I had gone from here, I clicked this. And then I went down and I started looking at some of the comments. So let's say that I work directly with Cisco WAN devices, right? I will just look at the guidance for global exploitation and click on that. This is going to give me the overall article on like, how it's impacting some of the organization in US and Canada, etc. And you can go down and you can click on the Catalyst SD-WAN, which is an actual appliance system. Basically, it's a router, right? So authentication bypass, that means that they can just go in and look at the configuration without authenticating to it. Possibly that there's older technology that's incorporated. You can also go down and select any of these. So what I did was I just clicked that link right here or this link right here, and then it's taking me to another page. And this is what you want. So Cisco documented, you see the CVE information. So usually the vendor does a good job of doing this. Okay. And it was identified or documented on the 25th of February, which is today. It is in critical, so this we have to fix now. Like if you're an analyst, this is what you need to do, right? The score is a 10. So the whole point is to introduce you to what it would look like. So if you don't have a VU number, it's fine. You can just leave that blank. You can go down and read the information and you can document it. It really depends on what you pick, right? So there's no 100% right or wrong, so it depends. So general description, give me the CVE information. Tell me if what kind of level of impact or if they have a solution for it. Sometimes they don't, okay? So if you look at that article, right, it tells me that this vulnerability exists because a peering authentication mechanism affected the system is working properly. The attacker could exploit and send specific the crafted requests to the affected system. So if they exploit it successfully, right, it allows them to function in a higher privilege, so they can manipulate network configuration, etc. So if they can bypass authentication, they can go in there and change things. So that is there a solution? Yes, they release an update to address this vulnerability. So if you're using this right now, right, you document this and you have to push updates like right away because it's critical. Okay, that's how we can solve it. And then it tells you about the product and also it affects. So here's the impact. Deployment type, you see like Cisco hosted WAN cloud, so that exists in the data center, or it's used routed to the data center, Cisco managed. So any kind of WAN cloud, Cisco hosted, and then the SD-WAN manager is for the Catalyst is what is. And then if you need to get the software, they give you a link, right? You can go and you can look at and test the download and then run the updates. Okay, so that's how we go about fixing that particular issue if this is what you're facing. Now, if you choose the other article, you kind of have to go to the next few pages to look at the information. This is something that it's going to take you time to find some information, right? So you can't do it just like by just one click. Information sometimes is a little bit deeper to navigate to, so you need to go through and look at it. Okay, like read it. Any question? Okay, so that was number 3. So for number 4, I give you Mandiant resources, and it's going to take you to Open IOC Basics. So when you click that link, it's going to take you to the website. You can use this to find information about your threat. Okay. So here it talks about the use case. So for malware, right? This is the common use case that you can incorporate. It has it documented. It tells you that it's going to give you the attribute, the binary of the malware, the artifacts, and the execution. And so it tells you about methodology, investigative approach. So to answer that question, how can the organization subscribe to this platform to be able to gather the intelligence on threat? Basically, we can obtain the attributes. So what are the attributes? Attributes could be like the nature of that particular malware, right? The file. Attributes could be the characteristics of that particular file. The binary files to identify the malware or the utility. You can use it to search for registry keys, especially when you're working with Windows environment. And registry keys simply indicate, right, the specific or the unique information that's used to modify hardware or software on Windows system. So when you need to look for specific registry keys, especially when you're performing forensic, that might be important. You can also search for run keys to identify malware utility. So when a malware is installed or ran on your system, right? Your system actually updates its state. So the way Windows works is anything that you install, it would update, it would add the registry key. So if you're working with malware or a malicious application, you would see that you can identify it or search for it. You can use the feed, which is some news information, to identify IP addresses, especially if you're getting attack patterns from a specific public IP. Or hash values, right, of malware utility. And you saw how the hash is documented from the virus share website. So hash values really uniquely identified that particular malicious file on the website. So if you need to validate or find additional information, this is also a good resource for you to use for gathering intelligence for analysis. And you can use it to compare metadata files that contain execution tools or backdoors, right? They say that backdoors is not as popular as it was years ago, but it still exists. So we can say that we can use this tool to look at the metadata, and metadata can contain specific nature of that file. So any questions? So I hope that by being exposed to these resources, you'll be able to see the content, right? So you can look through and you can subscribe to this platform. It actually walks you through on how to look at the metadata and the references of the IOC. So if you deal with if you have to reverse engineer a malware, this is also a good resource for you to refer to, okay? And then they have related articles. And in this field, you have to keep up with the feeds. If you don't, if you're going to be behind and you won't be able to have the appropriate control implemented. All right. So for 4, check out Mandiant. All the details that I put down here, you can obtain that from the actual page itself. I just summarize it a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about confidence rating level. When you're dealing with threats, if it's documented, usually they give it a range, right? So if the threat is confirmed, a lot of these sources are going to tell you that it's going to be like 90 to 100. That's like percent. If the threat is probable, so that means that it's just there's some inference or there's not a complete confirmation or a direct confirmation, you're going to see that it's going to be like probable. It's going to be in this range. And then the possible threat, which is lower, there's somewhat infer and it's not completely assessed. That means that it's not known. And so you would see that the rating is about 50 to 69%. And then improbable is lower. Okay. And then if it's discredited, that means that it's not confirmed and it's inaccurate. So it's going to be like a 1. Okay. So this is a range that we use. Now for Threat Connect rating, so this rating system, you can find additional information here. And the indicator for the management exchange it is a way that we can automate some information that's coming through. So if you're using sticks or structured threat information expression, it's gonna come in as XML like this, okay? And not all the direct information that we get from these tools are gonna be user-friendly, just keep in mind, right? So they usually just give you a brief description of the threat, when it was created, when it was modified. So for those of you who know forensic, right, you kind of get some MAC information, and then the name, if it's already been identified, usually typically they're given a name, some description, and then some goal, right? We need to read these because it might come through specifically targeting your system with the objective that it's designed to do. Okay? And then sometimes they will be able to give you like the motivation behind that threat. Um, Believe it or not, right, most of these things are created with an intention to do something. And so they're able to document it and and it's funny it comes the screenshot I gave you here. So it's local USB threat. So that means that like they can also put it on a USB, do a USB drop in the parking lot. That's how they can infiltrate into your organization. And so this is why a lot of the time we do physical assessment as well, right? Trojan tends to also come through USB a lot, or like you download it on your phone and you attach your phone to your network and that's how it spreads, right? So, so it gives you some information about some of the automated threat information, some of the documentation resources, right? Because some of you are like, oh, I'm interested in working for a malware company and I'm interested in this, right? A lot of the threat intelligence has to be done also for malware research. And so you're going to see that Mandiant indicator, some of the open IOC resources is very useful for that. That's what we saw with the exercise that we did. Okay. Okay. So for exam certification for this particular type of certification, a lot of the time they ask you questions about processes, right? Techniques, not necessarily specific tools. The tools that I give you is really for practice. Um, So this is the functioning area that we're talking about right here, right? There's two really levels in that. First, you gather information and what you're gathering is really feed into the requirements of what you would read if you're analyzing. And then once you collect the information, you want to document it, and your collection is going to go into your analysis process. So if your data is good here, the next step is more simpler, okay? If it is not clean here and you get a lot of garbage, you might have to go back and redo these things. So that's why I say you're 3 steps forward, you might find yourself like 3 steps back again, right? So that means that you want to have quality data collection so that way your analysis is good, is effective, right? And then once you have that, you're going to disseminate it. You're going to have to give it to your director, your executives, right? Your CISO, your team, your client, right? Most of the time, if you work for an IT or security service company, you have to disseminate that to their technical team so that way they can go through and implement the solutions that you recommend. So we want to have the dissemination after that. Okay, I'm going to flip 4 down real quick. All right, so the next exercise, number 5, refer to the threat intelligence life cycle. Briefly describe the activity that takes place in the phase of each cycle. So first, you're going to gather the requirements from historical breaches, trends, risk assessment results. So if you are a newbie, you're brought in to do this, you have to go back and look at like Were there breaches? Were there incidents, right? We want to go back and see. And if it's not documented, because that's a new position that they create specifically to address security problem, then you have to pull the logs, right? Network captures and be able to go from there. Okay. So what I would do is I would go from now until a few months back, or and eventually the whole year, and then work your way backwards. Because if you go 5 years back, right, compared to now, so you want to be more recent going backwards. Okay. So once you have gathered the information, and you will have to also use the internet resources like what I've shown you. You want to be able to collect the data from intelligent resources to meet the requirement. So if the organization is consistently dealing with breaches, that's going to be the focus and that's going to be the requirement. If the organization is dealing with insider threats, right? So it's going to be a different nature for the case and the activity for each organization. So once you have the data that would meet your goal, you're going to consolidate that. And so with that, we would want to be able to process it and analyze it. And you can use analytical tool. Some organization, they would have the software that you can use, but a lot of the times what you can do is you can implement some of the, online tools or the tools that you have at hand to be able to display, right? Typically, you have to take the piece of information here, the data that you have here, interpret it. You have to say that, oh, the trend for malware or the trend for attack is like this. Statistically, we're looking at, right, like 80% risk or, et cetera. So we have to be able to analyze the data in the next step. And then once you have that, you want to share that information. So you have to put it on a report, and you have to be able to send that to your managers, your colleagues, and then sometimes your partners or your client. And then you want to be able to get feedback on how you can improve. Typically, just maybe do a short survey or ask them, right, what additional things that they recommend for you to provide. Okay. So as an analyst in a cybersecurity environment, right, that's what you see. So when you see things like risk engineer or threat engineer, typically it's this. You have this. A lot of the time you have to find the threat. Sometimes your client, right, for example, they might not know what it is. Your job is to find it, and then you have to provide this information to them. Any question? Now I think the security industry is really supportive in sharing resources. I think if you were to enter this field 10 or 15 years ago, it might not be as abundant. I think the professionals now, they're really good at like building the community resources for you to be able to use. So that way you're not just going in there blind, right? So it's very helpful. So in the next section, in your notes, it talks about information sharing. And Information Sharing Analysis Center, it's known as ISAC. They break it down into 3 areas or 3 industries typically, right? And you ask like, why not the others, right? I think this is the focus in when they start developing the actual center. So there's 3 areas. One is going to be healthcare, and it gives you the direct link for that. So you can go to isac.org, but there's an H in the front for health. And then if you work with financial industry, you would go to this link for financial industry and then aviation. And you can find this also on the notes. So, how is it that this is related to the other industry? So, for example, you might have a school like this, a community college, and in the community college, we offer healthcare benefits to our people. And in the past, this is real incident that happened. Our employees' healthcare information was leaked, right? So they have to deal, the company that's contracted with the organization, they're gonna have to research like how the data got leaked. Was it from their own system or is it with the partner, which is the college? So you have businesses that offer healthcare and that might be related to them. You have businesses that take financial payments that might, they have financial systems. So not just banks, you have, companies that have investment and they have financial systems. Every company has financial systems because you got to make money to have a company. So you see some affiliation with that. And then aviation is mostly focused on like more logistic and transportations. Okay, so the prior exercise you can refer to page 2 and 3, and then ISAC, you can see that on page 3, and I also give you. So if you want other sectors, there's a link for other sectors, so you can find like other infrastructure here. So they didn't really leave anybody out, but it's under CISA. And then in the next part, we'll talk about threat actors and threat classification. So for 7 is ask you what kind of threat actors have the most resources, right? That means that they are in a higher level. So in cybersecurity, it's a race between resources and time, right? So when we implement security solutions, we're just buying time, right? And in order to buy time, you have to have resources. So it's always a race with resources and time, okay? And that means that if they have the most resources, they are likely to be successful, okay? So the groups that have the most resources are the nation state. And you tend to see like the APT group, the nation state sponsored group, right? Because they have the money, right? They have the backing. They might have, abundant amount of access to systems, powerful systems that a typical attacker doesn't, right? So nation state has the resources because it tends to be sponsored by government or agencies that are large. And then you have the second question is what type of threat actors are the most dangerous and difficult to detect? That will be your insider. So insider threats because they know your operation, they know your processes, they know the people, they know your assets. They can go stealth for a long time, like hidden, right? So insider threats, and it can be also regular employees that go rogue, right? People can be bought over time with a certain amount of resources or, things that they want, right? It could be a blackmail situation. So there's a lot of circumstances that you see. So when you deal with like government structure or highly sensitive information, a lot of the time we have to assess. So you ask yourself, right? Is my threat actor dangerous? Are they inside? Is it an external threat? Second, do they have the resources to be successful? Okay. So those two, this This is what gives you the job, right? All right. Okay, so it breaks it down to some of the categories, and you've probably seen this in many security classes. We're going to repeat it and make sure it sticks, right, until you complete the program. You have organized crime. You see plenty of this with phishing now, right? Spam, etc. Using people's identification information to commit crime. And then you got nation state. We talked about that. Advanced persistent threat groups. And then you got the hacktivists, like Anonymous, right? They do it for a political cause. And then you got the insider threat. So these are just the four common ones. There are other threat actors that is not in this particular list. And then in the threat classification, which is the next section, it's a way that we can identify and classify the threat into different groups. Okay? So, sorry, let me flip back to the notes and I'll put that back up. So when we do this, so for example, when you're dealing with a zero-day threat, right, which exploits an unknown vulnerability on a hardware or a software, so Microsoft Stride, it gives you these areas, okay? And so Microsoft does a lot of research and development in security also. So for one area, if we can use that to really look at, is it spoofing user identity, right? So the identity really pertains in the system, it's only being identified, right, by IP address or a MAC. Because even when you're using a user account, you're still using a system, and that system is identified in the network with an IP address or a MAC, which is a physical address, right? A media access controller address. In Apple systems, they call that a UID, or an Android system, they identify that as a UID, right? Or a system ID. And so that means that they have to have the tool to be able to spoof IP or MAC, or to be impersonating a user, right? Were they able to capture the password somehow, having some user account information? Did someone give them the privilege or access to that person's authentication credential? And then the second area for threat classification, it looks at the threat. Does it have a tampering capability, right? So when you look at the threat, you would say, is it spoofing, right? The second thing is it tampering? So tampering means that it is attempting to corrupt, delete a specific object, right? Like a file, a folder, a server object. And then the third area is repudiation. Does it change or delete logs? Okay. Because every activity in the system is recorded. We want to look at the transaction for the activity. So if there's a change, right? So if you monitor your logs, you would be able to see like when was it modified, right? And if you back up your log, you should be able to compare. It's different, right? From what you currently have to what you have saved. So is it changing or deleting logs? A threat could also disclose the information, so it would distribute data to other sources, typically a server elsewhere, and that server could exist on the dark web. You would see a lot of this with light phishing, right? And with phishing, you tend to see like DNS redirection, other things. So it would equip with like Trojan and etc. So a phishing tactic, if it is successful, it has other components that would hit some of these areas. Okay. And then denial of service. Does it cripple the server or the system where it would reduce the availability? And denial of service is about resource racing, right? So if it utilizes the buffer or it makes so much requests where the server cannot respond, That's considered that one area. And then on the last area for stride is going to be elevation of privilege. It would change or the user rights or the privilege for that user for that unauthorized access. So some threats hit some area, right? And some threat hits all. So it really depends on your case. So why do we really classify a threat, right? The way that we classify a threat is one, we need to use a common framework so that way it would streamline and it would be universal across the world, like global. And we use this to describe the threat so that way we can share that resources with other people, allowing others to really contribute and manage that information and that can be useful to other people, right? Second benefit is that when we have a known existing threat, it's easier and better to perform the analysis on that threat. Because you have a clearer picture, as it's already been documented and shared, right? So this is why the industry came up with the framework so that way we would classify the threat, right, in different areas, because some threat falls into one and sometimes they would encapsulate multiple areas. But this is helpful because if you facing the same threat that another organization similar to you that's facing, and you can see whether their solution is effective or not, right? And how you can approach it. So if it is effective, you can follow the model. If it is not, right, the recommendation, they might have recommendation for how to improve your solution to meet the criteria. So you don't have to start from scratch, typically. And I hope that when you write these things down, right, it helps you understand and remember, not just like write down information that's just seen on the screen. Okay, I'm gonna move 9 down. And I think if you took my classes before, you might have seen Talos Intelligence, Repudiation Center. This is a way that we can also get general information about a public IP or a domain, right? So when you're working with a public IP or domain, you can use the resources. So you can press Control and click this. It's gonna take you to the intelligence. In here, you just simply put an IP address. You know who this belongs to? Who's the biggest search engine in the world? Yeah. And sometimes you might not get all the information that you need because the provider or the target might be blocking that. So for example, you can attempt like Meta or Instagram, Facebook, right? They might not give you because they have a security company that prevent you from accessing a lot of the information that they have only because they're very targeted, right? So when you visit the site, you're gonna see, right? It's gonna tell you the host name, the domain name, the owner of that particular IP address or domain. Um, and then so just go through the detailed information and it tells you that they use encryption for the DNS. That's important. That's good, right? And they also own a range of IP. So you want to put down your host name, your domain, your network owner, your sender, IP repudiation information. So for reporting, you don't just record these things. You have to really look further in details, right? But I want to kind of point you to the direction on how you can look up this information. And then if you need to use who is, sometime that doesn't always work, right? And then email volume history. So they don't have it, they're not, there's no, it doesn't exist on any block list. But let's say that you're using an IP from China or, like on your logs, right? That you got. So you take the IP and you plug it in and you can see, right? Does it exist on a certain block list? Are they affiliated with any email server? Sometimes, you can get drill down information, sometimes you cannot, right? So, and then web reputation. All right. So now this is the reputation center of Talos Intelligence. On the next step, the next exercise, we're going to look at vulnerabilities. Okay. So this website also have resources on vulnerabilities. They document some of the vulnerabilities that exist. Okay. So so there's all the 0 days report. Imagine, right? You got a lot of 0 days. Okay. And then there's this closed report. So the 0 day report, you can pick any of these. So GeoVision is the vendor, and it would change, of course, time to time, right? So if you revisit this like a month later, it will also have the newer updates. Okay. And then you can also sort it by software vendor. So it depends on who is your vendor, and you would, so you can put down some of the software vendor that you see. So if you want to check to see if you are vulnerable to 0 day, you can check this, right? Search for your vendor. So that means that if it's already been recorded on the website, that someone else already faced that problem, right? Or they have researched and documented it and shared that here. So you can pick a software vendor on that list and you can record it. Okay, so now let's go through and talk about research and modeling, right? So we talked about reputation. We talked about looking at the vulnerability center on Talos Intelligence. If you need to assess behavior, especially like attacks and malware, Mitre is very good, right? I think if you took ethical hacking with me, or you're currently taking that, you will see this, right? You've seen this before in that class, or another class. So they kind of break it down into the steps, right? In different type of attacks. So you can go through and you can see like gathering intelligence, if it's doing for the victim's host compared to searching from databases. So there's different techniques. And if you click like the technique, it takes you to the article and they document and they give you examples. Um, so over time you have a reference of this. Okay, the tools that's used, how effective it is, what it's used for, like phishing. Okay. So Mitre attack is very good for searching or researching an behavior for a certain threat. And then you can also refer to diamond model intrusion analysis. This is the model that the industry recommends when you are looking at adversary threats. So we would start with events that are detected and discovered, right? And that based on that events, we would be able to analyze and discover more or research more information that's going to help us understand what's happening to our system, right? So this is the diamond. So you would use logs to show the activity in the case if it is coming through the network, right? And then you would be able to identify that particular adversary threat. And looking at the capability. So in the next step, you're going to look at what that threat is targeting. And so you can use things like your security management system, log information, and it would show the activity, like what's blocking, what kind of attempt that's being performed. And then you're going to examine the actual target, right? Let's say it's a server or a user system and see what has been compromised there. And then based on that analysis, you would determine the capability of that threat. Like, why did it target this particular system? What was the intention? What was it doing? So it tells you the capability of that threat. So that's the diamond model. And so for number 12, it says, what type of model helps analysts discover more information by highlighting the relationship between elements and security events? You would use diamond model of intrusion analysis. Now, it's not only the model, right? There's just different approach in how we would analyze the actual event. And for pen testing, typically we refer to the Lockheed model, which is the Lockheed Martin kill chain model. It often referred to as a kill chain model if you're going for Pen Test Plus, or it might refer to this particular model more. So the next question asks you, how can security professional detect and combat activities in the first stage of this model? So let's say that it's very early in the attack phase, right? Like, for example, someone is using Nmap to scan your systems, right? You want, in the recon stage, you want to be able to like stop it there. So the first stage of the model it's actually just recon. They are basically using techniques to be able to confirm or select a target. So that means that they will research the target, they would gather the information about the target, and that could be harvesting email addresses from your organization, like employees, directors, staff, members of your organization. So that from there, they would then identify individuals and then correlate that to the individual social media, accounts or profile that is publicly available. So let's say that you might have an executive that uses LinkedIn. Their information might be public. And so now there are tools that we can do this, automate this process, right, from a pen test perspective or an attacker perspective. Okay? Like Maltego will be able to pull like the web information and tell you who is on social media with the email addresses that's given, right? Then they can go through and they would collect your PR information, your press release, maybe some public. So when you work with public sector, a lot of the contracts is published right? Who won the contract? How much money is that organization spending on that contract? So, and that could also be like related to military, to warfare-based organization, some information public that might be shared. And then you know that the military, they have private information that they keep for the contract for the safety reasons, right? But they would be able to pull that information or maybe attendance to specific conferences that can be important for the target. And then any kind of servers that are public. Okay. And like I said, there are tools that are made, but if you think about it, it's actually a simple script that you can also write, right? So a lot of these tools are stem from scripts, and it's a lot of these tools are console based, so it's just executing through the terminal. As long as you have connectivity to, you know, but like I said, recon tools, some are passive, some are active, right? So how can you detect if someone is trying to recon you? Um, One, you can look at your website logs to see who is searching and if there's alerts. Because if they're scraping your web, you are going to see that in your logs. You can also use browser analytics in web administration to look at your web across the infrastructure, because you might have like web app, you might have like pages that you would have for customer and also internal employee. So you can use browser analytics for that. There are detection tools that you can use for active scanners, right? But typically you would use security appliance to detect, because when they scan, it actually launch script to your server, right? So if I run Nmap and I put in your IP address, your system is going to have to respond to my request with the script. So Nmap using NSE, and so what that does is it launches a bunch of scripts and it just sends it. But if your firewall or your intrusion prevention system or your security appliance block those scripts, block any scripts in general, which we can't automate if we do that, right? Then it's just gonna stop it. But it reports that on the blog on the log saying that these many attempts, right? Like, because when you run Nmap, if you ever see, it tells you if you do like an aggressive scan, it tells you these many scripts were launched to the target, right? So on the logs, it should tell you like this system is trying to send this script to your target system, like your web server, etc. So if your security appliance is doing its job, if your security system is doing its job, then but if it goes unseen, then you have to go back and see, oh, what am I doing with the configuration here, right? So to combat recon, you are going to build detection for browser behavior uniquely for reconnaissance. Internally, we can control a lot of this too, but for our website, you can actually code this, right? You can also look at like which browser they're using, what are they visiting your website from. A lot of these things that you can pull for web administration. Second, we can prioritize defense around technology and people based on recon techniques. Like what I said, right? Technology, we can do better with security appliance configuration. We can train people to not give out information when they're doing intelligence gathering, and just awareness in general, right? Um, is typically important for most of the people in the organization. Any question? So when we're threat hunting, a lot of the times, in most cases, it might be like a reactive situation, right? Like you have a threat, your client has a threat, you're hired to go in there and stop that threat from, impacting their systems. But we want to be more proactive. That means that we want to be learning about the potential threats that might be coming to our network and system. So that means that you have to advance in your skill sets, your knowledge in threats, your organization security structures. That means that it always needs to be improving. So there's always work to be done. Making sure that leveraging the mature threat or the analysis function to overall reduce risk. So you want to be able to analyze it and say, right, what is the expectation of specific threat? And your risk level needs to be in the lower area. So every year we need to drive to a lower risk or a way that we can accept or tolerate that risk in that it won't jeopardize the operation, but it won't compromise our system in general. This is hard, right? This what keeps people employed because you know that it's always a moving picture, right? So if we stop today, right, tomorrow it's going to be something else. So the job is never done. And it can be very exhausting. So if you talk to some professional that have been in the field for a long time, but you can make it where it would be interesting. It's very motivating, right? So it really depends. So if you work in threat hunting most of your career, it's all about like catching the changes. Any questions? Okay. So Lockheed, I give you the screenshot, the kill chain screenshot there. And then it talks about common vulnerability scoring system, your CVSS. It doesn't always cover all threats. It does describe just the vulnerability and its score. And then here for the last question, proactive threat hunting, it talks about this. So here I listen in details. So I actually when I was trying to hire someone to also teach these classes, and they have to have work experience in this area, right? And one of the options was to talk about threat hunting. So these are the activities that you see with threat hunting, right? So you would start with a test question or hypothesis. You want to profile your threat actor, like what we've done. And then you want to build out your techniques, skills, and tools to be able to analyze that threat. And then ultimately, we want to look at how it would impact our organization and reduce the risk from that threat, right? So if you apply to a job and it tells you that it involves threat hunting, these are the things that you're going to be doing. Okay? And let's say an analyst position requires some threat hunting. You see a lot of jobs tells you that, right? So assess and understand and address threat after vectors, and then security landscape is important. So you're going to do intelligence gathering. You're going to be able to, do some analysis. So you have to detect threat and vulnerability and then be able to see if that threat plays on the vulnerability. So, okay. The next one is going to be for chapter 3. So I'm going to move this down. And so we can cover 15 and onward in the next 30 minutes or less. Okay, so what is needed when you are performing active reconnaissance in your system and network? So recon is going to tell us a few things, right? What are the vulnerabilities we're facing? What kind of threat we're facing? And so gathering information. Before you do any active reconnaissance using any of the tool like Nmap, make sure that you have a written permission that authorize you to do the analysis right, on specific system, whether you are an employee of that company, if you're working with the client, if you are, external coming in as a contractor, make sure that you have a written, right? Sign, witness, the whole works, just like what we talked about, because this is part of like pen testing. Okay. So before you perform anything, right, if they don't have any kind of written agreement, sign, right? Sometime you need to make sure that you review the legal criteria because, there might be clauses in there that holds you liable, right? Because sometimes tools open up avenue and you want to be careful. So there's also risk in using these tools. All right. So if you are using Nmap, that is an active reconnaissance tool. It scans ports, it footprint OS. So Nmap is an active tool. If you're using exploitation kits, right, or the toolkits like Metasploit, that is active. It calls home. So who you scan sees you because you see them, right? And then you got, if you're using hping, right? I show this in CIS-47 for those who had me, or if you're using dig or host command, those call home. So it comes back to the source. So those are active tools. So how can you passively doing recon? So when we're doing active reconnaissance, we are directly, right, interacting with the target system. The IP address that we're using, that's the specific system or the domain name, etc. If you're doing passive reconnaissance, you're indirectly, right, assessing that system. So you can use things like packet sniffer, Wireshark, T-Shark, etc. You can also use Whois, right? Whois is a tool that you can use in command line or on the web. You can use specialized search engine like Shodan, which is specifically for IoT, etc. Right? Shodan now requires that you create an account and they look at your activity, right? So there are specific search engine for certain things, not just Google or, Firefox, etc. But those are the difference. Okay. So on your notes, I give you the breakdown, and then here it talks about if you're doing mapping or enumeration. So if you're using host enumeration, it basically maps out like the entire network, the systems, or the infrastructure. Let's say that, hello, if you're a pen tester, if you're an analyst, and you don't know much about your target, this is very good. It's going to tell you, because they call it the double blind assessment. That means that you know nothing about the network, right? Like you might have one IP address, but they might have a lot of systems. So this can tell you about the infrastructure, potentially what kind of things that they might have. They might have stuff on DMZ. So I put some link and some documentation and standards that you can refer to. And then when you go down here, it talks about making sure that you have granted permissions for active reconnaissance, right? Mapping the networks, you can use ZenMap, you can use some scan tools. Nmap or ZenMap actually maps out like where you are to your target. So you would see something like this, right? How many hosts in between, how many hops, like your routers. You can also use commands like traceroute, and that's different between Windows and Linux, right? But it does give you like how many hops in between you follow that traffic. But traceroute also sends the request back to your system, so it is also active. So you got to be really careful about some of these commands, okay? Even though they're commands, they're not actual tools, it does call home. So it sends the request back, okay? Like hping comes back to the requester. Ping does that. because the packets come back. You send the packets to the destination, it comes back H-ping. Okay. Other options you can see, Angry IP Scanner. I talked a little bit about Tenables. Tenables is really good for finding vulnerability for a group of systems. But keep in mind that when you run Tenable Nessus, if you have 100 computers, it's going to take a while because it needs to go and assess each system. So it does inventory on your network to tell you these are the many systems that you have it connected. And then, now if you guys wanted to test this, you can go and download the basic version, right? But the professional version is about $2,000 and up. And then I listed some of the search engine that you can see. I talked about Shodan before, but you would see that there are other search engines for specific things. And then some of the security tools that would combat some of these, right? If they're used for recon. Email addresses, you can use Hunter. There's so many things, right? So these are some good resources for you to look at and play with. Some we will use in our class and some we don't. Okay. The next part after that, it talks about footprinting, and footprinting is also about like finding details about your system software. So what we're going to do is we are going to do some research. So we are going to open up command prompt and you can type in CMD or command prompt and you would see this. You can run it as a regular user because the school computer doesn't allow you to use admin privilege. So just click open the app. And I can't change the font because it's not my system, but you're gonna do NS lookup. And you just need to put in the domain name and press enter. Enter. So it tells you that this is my current network. And then this is the target that I'm looking for, right? And then they do have a range of addresses that they own. So that would be something simple as looking up your DNS information, right? So what kind of information is displayed? You can see, interpret that, right? Your server, your DNS server and its IP, which is your local server, and then your target domain and its IP address. You notice that they're using v6. And then you do have some v4 and IPv6 combined. And we can drill it down. We can look for a certain DNS record. So if you took 40A, right, remember that when we're looking at MX record, that's for mail exchange, and that's a Microsoft product. MX is used for mail server, right, that is correlated with the DNS. Of course, you have to have the DNS, hence you have, myemail.com or in your case, you have student.rccd.com email addresses, right? And so that would tie to the sub domain that is under our district. So open up your command prompt again. Let me scroll this up a little bit so we can put it all on one screen. And you are going to put in additional options. So you're going to do NS lookup. And you're going to do a dash query equal MX for the record, and then the target domain. So if you are looking for a specific record, you're just going to query that particular parameter. Now you know that if they're using DNSSEC, you are not going to be able to see the A or the quadruple A. They should have a quadruple A. as they're running IPv6. Microsoft does, right? But we can look at MX. Usually MX record is publicly available because a lot of the email, like your live.com, your Microsoft.com, other email that's related to Microsoft funnel back to their server, like Outlook, right? You see? And now I think it funneled everything back to Outlook. They stopped hosting it separately. It's still, even though it's called live, but it comes back to this particular mail server. So you would see that. And they do have the protection here. So it's not easily taken down. You can find information, but it's not always an easy target, right? So it does have some public IP information. So now you know how to find things with just a command, right? Does it have priority level, right? So there is a reference here. So you have a 10. What does a 10 mean? That means that it is the highest. And 10 is like a score that used for priority for routing purposes. This is actually configured in the routes for those mail server. So if you see reference as a 10, then that means it's high priority. And I put the note here so you can interpret it. So use that for validating the ownership of the domain, right? Okay, on the last two, any question regarding this particular command? So you should see something like this, right? You can screenshot and add it to your assignment if you want to, have a reference, but you can always try different domain information. Okay, so that's that. For 19, we're gonna visit SCN Soft, and I want you to gather as much information about this company as possible. I feel bad that I targeted them, but so basically you want to know, like, what is the name of the company, what kind of industry they're in, do they have multiple locations? Is there organizational hierarchy? Like, is there a different level of management and different level of employees? Do they have articles or related press that is out there? And do they have any partners or clients? So when you're doing passive, right, recon, this is the things that you do. You just go to the website, right? So about the company, they tell you, right, they've been 36 years in IT. You can go and click some information, right? They tell you some history information, company overview. They service, these are the industry. So they are an IT service company, right? You see that. You saw that at the beginning, right? 36 years in IT. And then you can go through and you can look. So I want you to look through the website that is given to you there and see if you can find some resources on this company, right? So I can go to about, I can look at services, I can look at their partners by looking at industry. So if you click our expert, likely that you will find some of the employee, might not be their name, right? So sometimes it takes a little bit of effort to go, and now you have also access to AI. So AI can do a lot of the work for you as well in Recon. Okay, so let's try to answer these 5 things about the company. If you can't find it, you say information not found, right? Etc. So what I'm showing you here is a passive way to gather information. And I know in pen testing class 27B, I talk about how you can use operators with the search engine to be able to drill down the information. And then lastly, it asks you, how can an organization prevent active reconnaissance activity? So we want to reduce external exposure, public exposure to services, or any kind of footprint about the organization. Sometimes that is hard because the web is a way that you can market your product, your service, your company, right? We can also use it to hire people, to, get customer. So you kind of have to look at like what kind of sensitive information would be out there and not needed, right? So that will be too exposed. So you want to remove some of that. You can use intrusion prevention system to stop probe, like what I talked to you about, right? Prevent scripts from being transmitted into your network. And then you can use monitoring or alerting system. Your SIEM is your security management system is going to be good at telling you, right? Or even firewall or IPS, it has ways you can set up alerts where it tells you who's probing you and from which IP. And then you need to monitor because it could be also internal. So we want to be able to monitor the network to look for packets or anomalies on our network activity, and then also our system's performance and activity. So these are the things that you need to look at as part of your responsibility in the security operation area. Any question? Okay, so I recommend looking through the notes again, right? I shortcut or I summarize a lot of these things, but I have included tools and resource and screenshot for you to look at. It talks about like the logs, which logs can you go through? Because we talked about, looking at these systems. You can look at ACLs, you can look at system logs, you can look at what's rejected or allowed. You can look at, successful or failed. Sometime like in Windows environment event viewer, you can look at application logs, security logs, setup logs, system logs, etc. So parsing logs is gonna be your world, right? Logs is a lot. Sometimes you just have many files to go through. So if you can streamline it by using Python scripts or whatever it is to parse through these logs, or using a tool that's useful. And then some of the commands. And the last part also talk about like some physical information, electronic document harvesting. It touches on like MIT immersions to visualize data in email networks. I really think CAPTCHA is not all that effective, but it stops the bots for most part. For most part. Okay. CAPTCHA started as a game. And the person who created CAPTCHA, he's a professor at Carnegie Mellon. He did work for Google, and I think he did a lecture, so you can probably find him on YouTube. He designed CAPTCHA for people to click. It is a way to catalog all the images on the internet, and they're doing a good job for doing that. So whenever you click CAPTCHA, like sidewalk, stairs, buses, bikes, you're actually cataloging the metadata information on those images. Did you know that? Oh, what a good way to use images, right? For two things. Okay, I'm gonna stop the video.